Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by Marcus Vincent, and we're going to do something a little bit different today. In preparation for a long-awaited series on the Ignatian epistles, we are going to give you, based on popular demand and what you've been asking for in the comments and in the Discord, an introduction of sorts to the Ignatian question, the history of Ignatius of Antioch and the epistles that he wrote. And hopefully this video will provide a sort of basis from which we can then build on in the subsequent videos, looking at the recensions and letter collections in more detail, so you'll understand some of the shorthand that we use and some of the questions that we're trying to answer when looking at the Ignatian epistles. So in short, then, what we're trying to do today is tell you who was Ignatius of Antioch. What can we know about this fellow? So, as always, we should start with what tradition says. And as is often the case on this channel, we have been known to disagree with some of the traditional views on our early Christian figures. But I think it's helpful to get a picture of what tradition says about these figures before we begin to come in with scholarship and critical minds and undermine it, just so we can see not just what the early Christians believed about their peers or those just preceding them, but even what even later Christians thought up until the 18th, 19th, and even 20th century. So what do we know about Ignatius according to tradition? Well, he was born sometime in the middle of the 1st century. And he was elected the 3rd Bishop of Antioch, the great diocese that was led by none other but the apostle himself, Peter. And this Ignatius figure was given a nickname, Theophorus, or God Bearer. A really interesting insight into the way he was viewed by later Christians to be given such a title, and also one of the great clues that we might discuss later into the evolution of the epistles and who actually gave him this name originally. And during his life, he served as the Bishop of Antioch, and towards the end of his life, during the reign of Trajan, after Trajan decreed that Christians should worship the pagan gods, Ignatius caused a fuss about this and was eventually arrested somewhere in Syria and taken to Rome by 10 leopards, the name that he gives to the soldiers that are carrying him. And he makes this great journey from the east to the west, passing through Asia Minor and Greece, and eventually ending up in Rome, where he faces his martyrdom in front of lions. And we get these great icons, which is the thumbnail indeed of this video, depicting him being eaten alive, munched and crunched by these lions in some form of amphitheatre. And during this journey, he writes letters. And tradition tells us that he writes 7, or at least Eusebius of Caesarea tells us that. And these 7, as we will see in a moment, eventually become known as the Middle Recension and are widely accepted by scholars today as a majority as the authentic Ignatian epistles. And we also get an account of his martyrdom by a supposed eyewitness that tells us the great torments he suffered at the Romans' hands and the eventual demise that he met at the jaws, or the paws, let's say, of the lions in the theatre. So that's a rough sort of overview of what tradition has told us about Ignatius and what the early Christians believed about him, or indeed made up about him through hagiographical texts and folklore or myths, we might say. But these letters really, I think, are the most interesting thing about Ignatius. Before we even get to looking at his life, or who he could have been, or what we can reconstruct about him, we should first look to the letters that he supposedly wrote and trace their history through time and their reception, because I think that if we can know what he wrote, if indeed he wrote anything, then we might be able to say at least something more about him. Now, in my forthcoming PhD, which is hopefully going to be published soon, you will have an opportunity, if you so like, to read about some of the early attestations of the Ignatian epistles. And we might touch on them briefly today with people like Irenaeus quoting from Ignatius and other early Christian figures too. But I want to, if I may, not take us through the early attestations in this video, but rather through the actual manuscript evidence or the editions that are published of Ignatius to see how the Western world in particular traced these things or found out about them, because that will give you a better understanding about where scholarship stands on these matters and how they have viewed the texts. Now, the first place that we can really see the Ignatian epistles come to light is in 1495. And there's 3 epistles that you probably, almost certainly, have never heard of attributed to Ignatius, unless indeed you've been following my work and Marcus's work very closely over the last few years. That is namely the 2 epistles of Ignatius to John the Apostle and one to the Virgin Mary and her response to Ignatius. And these letters are found only in Latin. And so their discovery in 1495 met with quite a mixed set of views. Some quite traditional and conservative said, well, yeah, they're probably true. They're fantastic. Isn't it great that we have letters written by Mary, the mother of Jesus? Whilst on the other hand, some people did see straight through them and said these are more likely than not forgeries. And these letters have largely gone unstudied and unlooked at, largely because people do think that they are spurious. And that does become the majority view throughout the rest of scholarship, hence your lack of knowledge of them. Where the question becomes more interesting, and you might recognise some of these epistles, is only 3 years later, in 1498, where we get several epistles of Ignatius published to the Trallians, the Magnesians, the Tarsians, the Philippians, the Philadelphians, the Smyrnaeans, to Polycarp, the Antiochians, the Deacon, Hero, Ephesians, and Romans. And when these are published, again, only in Latin at this point, they do create some stir, for their contents are very interesting and give an insight, if you believe they're true, a very interesting insight into early Christianity. And this version of the epistles would eventually become known as the Long Recension. But naturally, at this point, they're not known as long, short, or middle because they're the only recension that are really in circulation. In 1516, a very similar edition was published, but this included one extra letter to a certain Mary of Casobala. And again, these are only in Latin and in what we would call now the Long Recension. Move forward 60 years or so, it changes quite quickly, and in the 16th century, the Ignatian question really starts to take on some movement and some traction, and this will continue over the next 100 years as well, because a Greek edition of the Ignatian epistles was found, which includes, and hopefully you'll understand the shorthand here based off what I've said a moment ago about the letters in previous recensions, which included many of the letters, in fact 12 of the letters. And it's at this point that we then can ask a couple of questions. To what extent does the long edition in Greek agree with the long edition in Latin? And can we perform comparative tests on these things to see if the Greek and the Latin are related? It takes some time for this to happen, but eventually in 1608 and in 1623, we do get some figures who look at these editions and try to work out whether or not these are genuine, and if they are, which ones, and provide some evidence for that. However, all of the work done to this point on the Ignatian epistles is dwarfed by the work of the Bishop of Armagh, James Ussher, an Englishman, a Protestant, but someone who is very interested in the Ignatian epistles. And he publishes another Latin manuscript of the Ignatian epistles, but entirely unique from all that had preceded it. namely because it had a different amount of text in it. There was less text than in the long recension, and so it became originally known as the shorter recension of Ignatius. And this is where the terminology can get a little bit confusing, because after a future publication by William Cureton, which we'll look at in a second, this recension would actually become known as the middle recension. Okay, so at this point it's the shorter, but later on it becomes the middle recension. That's why I've put that here. And this recension, or letter collection, did not have within it Ignatius' letter to the Philippians. So the letters that were there, it had less material within it, so that made it interesting in and of itself, but it also omitted Ignatius' letter to the Philippians. And Ussher tried really hard to try and work out which ones were genuine and which ones weren't, as he still suspected that even in this shorter version of the text compared to the Latin and Greek longer recension, that this text was interpolated and corrupted. So he went through it trying to wrestle out which ones were genuine and which ones were not. In 1646, and unfortunately for Ussher's sake, he tried to get hold of this manuscript but couldn't. Voss publishes a Greek middle recension. So it's the same pretty much as Ussher's Latin middle, again at that time known as the shorter, but this time in Greek, which was believed at the time to be the original language in which these texts were written, and therefore was more likely to bear an older version of the text. And you can see here there's something quite unique about this recension as well. It includes Smyrnaeans, Polycarp, Ephesians, Magnesians, Philadelphians, Trallians, the letter to a certain Mary and her response, and then only half of Ignatius to the Tarsians. Now, it was the belief, and still remains so, that this is because of either a loss or a corruption in the manuscript family tradition, and that there were indeed more manuscripts, letters attached in these manuscripts, but for one reason or another, it was lost in one family, and then the scribes just continued to transcribe only half of Tarsians without the others that were there. But either way, this Greek translation was seriously important for the question of Ignatius.
Jack, could you, just to interrupt you for a moment, could you just go back one slide? Yeah, probably one should point out here that in Ussher's publication of the Latin middle recension, it's not just that Ignatian to the Philippians is missing, but I think it's also important to see that Ignatian to the Romans is appended at the end. And as you can see, despite the fact that the Latin of some of these letters are what we call now the middle recension, we have letters like the letters to the Trallians or to Mary of Cassabula, of the Tarsians and the Antiochenes, Hero and so forth, which of course have never been in a middle recension. So these are letters always in the long recension. So when Ussher here says that the other letters are in the middle recension, a short recension, we have in this manuscript a combination of letters in a shorter recension, which we call now the middle recension, and of a long recension. This is important because when we now switch to the next slide, which you have shown, first we notice Ignatius to the Romans is missing at all. So what was appended by Ussher is missing here in Voss. And we don't have 7 letters in the middle recension. We have only 6 of these letters in the middle recension. And again, like in the manuscript before and the publication before, these letters in the middle recension are combined with letters which only appear in the long recension. So we don't have a manuscript so far and a publication where we have the so-called letters in the middle recension as a standalone version. So we always have them in combination between middle and long recension. Sorry for just pointing out.
You're absolutely right, and indeed that'll be something that actually we're going to come to in just a second. But it's good to point that out now, just to not create any confusion about the Ussher edition. And indeed, one of the other things that makes Romans unique, and we'll come on to Romans probably quite a lot over the next few minutes, is that Runhart in 1689 publishes another edition of Romans. So not only is Romans missing from some manuscripts, it also enjoys a separate lively transmission. And this version that Runhart presents is part of the martyrdom of Ignatius, that supposed eyewitness who watched Ignatius die and go through all his trials and tribulations. So those two things are combined, the martyrdom of Ignatius mixed in with Romans. Now, during this time, people argue in and out of the Ignatian epistles this whole time, with Protestants and Catholics largely falling into two distinct groups, Catholic loving them and more extreme Protestants not. The exception to that is Anglicans, such as Ussher, who defend them, but certainly people like John Calvin said there was nothing more ridiculous than to believe that Ignatius wrote this rubbish. And Calvin obviously comes, as we'll see in a moment, to dislike them largely because of their content rather than scholarly inquisition. But either way, the middle recension of the 7 epistles do become the favoured recension and collection, and that largely stays the same. However, in 1845, the debate shifts drastically. And William Cureton, the great hero of this channel, maybe the patron saint, depending on what we believe about those, do go back and watch the video I made about him some time ago looking at his life, publishes a collection in 1845 and writes several notes and other texts about them until 1849. And this collection, even in Ussher's wildest dreams, who even understood that this Greek middle recension was probably corrupted, could not have possibly imagined what Cureton dug up, or people on Cureton's behalf dug up in 1845. Namely, a new recension in Syriac that only contained Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans. So not only are we now missing several letters, but these versions of Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans are also much shorter, particularly in the case of Ephesians, than any other attestation of them thus far. And it's really not an overestimate to say that this put the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of the Ignatian question. And people began, in certainly the immediacy after their publication, to agree with Cureton that this Syriac shorter version of 3 letters was more likely to be genuine. And the first to really come out and combat this and argue against them was in 1873, the great German Theodor Zahn. And he writes a slightly muddled book, I think it's fair to say. The scholarship in it is good, but it's not always very clear, especially as a non-native German speaker. It's very difficult to read. And says, actually, Cureton is wrong. Cureton and his 3-letter collection is merely an abbreviation of the middle recension of 7 letters, and except in the case of Ignatius' letter to the Romans, which Zahn does not accept as genuine for one of the reasons Marcus just said about its missing in some places, he says we should accept the other 6 as Ignatian. And this is quite a popular opinion and is taken up by Joseph Barber Lightfoot. And Lightfoot really, I think it's fair to say, puts the final nail, or several of the nails. If Zahn puts the first nail, Lightfoot puts all the nails that are left into the coffin of Cureton's theory. Lightfoot says that actually the middle recension of 7 letters, including Romans, so he rejects Zahn on that front, are genuine. And one of the reasons he says that is because they are enumerated or mentioned by Eusebius of Caesarea. Now, he brings other evidence to the table as well, such as stylistic and lexicographic similarities between the different letters in the various recensions. But for the most part, he loves the idea that they're mentioned by Eusebius and have been received through tradition. And despite knowing quite well the manuscript history of these texts, Lightfoot does seem to ignore it quite a bit and cherry pick, as we will see, from where he wishes to create his new idea of the 7 in the middle recension being the only authentic Ignatian epistles. And this becomes the vast majority consensus for some time. I would argue even till this day, most scholars still accept, if they do any at all, the middle recension of the 7 letters of Ignatius. And you can see here, there were some who have opposed this theory throughout the 20th century, including our good friend here, Vincent, with his Dr. Walter Hubner and colleague Lechner. But this was, I think, fair to say, still a minority view to this day, that the Ignatian epistles are either A, either all forgeries, or B, that the short recension is the genuine one. And I think what's really interesting about the colleagues that I've mentioned here is that their argument tends to be, in the 20th century, only with the middle recension of the 7 letters. So the argument really only rests between those who accept the Ignatian middle recension or those who reject it. And the other recensions are largely, though not exclusively, overlooked. Ryu Kamp does present a slightly different theory, accepting 4 of the 7 letters, but he really was in a minority on that front. The question changes again, and this is a big leap forward in terms of recovering the Curetonian hypothesis in 2019, when again our friend here, Marcus Vincent, publishes his 2019 book, looking at Cureton's texts and works, and beginning to question some of the presuppositions about which we have covered so much thus far, namely that we have a short, a middle, and a long recension. And Vincent says, well, look, actually the manuscript data, the evidence that we have, doesn't really bear out having these 3 recensions. And indeed, even speaking of letter collections, i.e. of having a 3-letter collection like Cureton, or a 7-letter collection like Lightfoot, or a 12 or 13-letter collection like some of the earliest editions, is actually a real misnomer among scholarship. And so that if we're going to even begin to talk about the Ignatian epistles again, we must first address the way in which we refer to them and how we understand the evolution of the text. And then, after hearing this in 2018, I decided to take up a PhD on the same subject, building on Marcus's 2019 book, in favour, at least in part, of the Curetonian texts against the middle recension. Now, naturally, I wrote 107,000 words on this topic for my PhD, and we only have an hour together today, so you'll have to buy the book when it comes out. But I want to give you a little insight without bias. I think that's one of the aims that many of you mentioned you wanted in the Discord and in the comments, that you didn't necessarily want our points of view yet or our biases coming in. You just wanted a description of the state of affairs. And so that's what we're going to do as unbiased as we can today, if that's possible, of some of the questions of why we even think we need to ask the question before we attempt to give you our answers. And so the first thing I want to bring your attention to, and this was, for me, what rocked my entire world. This chart here, which I made for my PhD, I made it almost at the very beginning, shook me to my core in terms of how we refer to the Ignatian epistles. And let me just help you out by explaining what's happening here. So at the very top of the screen, you'll see LC or SS3. LC refers to letter collection. So we have a 1-letter collection, a 7-letter collection, a 9-letter collection, etc. And SS3 just refers to the shorter Syriac 3 letters. And the reason why I put SS3 in here and not the others is because this 3-letter collection is the only one we have in Syriac. So we don't have the 3-letter collection in Greek or Latin or Coptic or Armenian, etc. We only have this one Syriac collection. So you look to the far left, and then you'll see all the letters of Ignatius. And where you see an X crossing over, you will see that that particular letter is present in that collection. And at the top, whether it's a middle or long recension version. And the thing that shook me first and foremost was on the far left, where you could see 1-letter collection, so i.e. a letter all on its own, not connected to any of the other epistles, is Polycarp. Polycarp is present on its own in a manuscript which is now in the British Museum without any of the letters appended to it in Syriac. And it's in the short recension, the short version of the text, similar to what we find in Cureton's SS3, as I've put it here. And that immediately began to question in my mind, well, hold on. Lightfoot's only ever told me about a 3, a 7, or a 13 letter collection, as has everybody else. But we have a 1 letter collection, a letter all on its own. There's clearly at least one problem with the nomenclature, so I went through my thesis and added in the 1 letter collection. And then, if you look to the right-hand side of that, you'll see in a middle form, and I put that in inverted commas really, because the forms differ, are Ignatius' letter to the Romans, which, as we mentioned earlier, in Runehart's edition, appears as part of the Acts of Martyrdom, or the Martyrdom of Ignatius. But that's not the only place where Romans appears on its own. It also appears on its own, just without anything else around it, without the Martyrdom of Ignatius. And indeed, we have at least 50 manuscripts of Romans on its own, an unbelievable number, where it's not found with any other letter. And that feeds back into what Marcus brought up earlier, that sometimes Romans is missing in some of the other manuscripts. So I added another 1 letter collection, that of the Romans. Then you'll see quite clearly ones which we have mentioned, the shorter 3 letter collection of Curaton, which has Polycarp, Romans, and Ephesians in it, and we have 2 manuscripts for that. And then, rather misleadingly, we have a 7 letter collection, and you'll notice here that it says long recension and not middle. That's because we have no edition or manuscript of the 7 letter collection in the middle recension without the other letters appended to it. And even this edition of the 7 letters is quite late. And now you've gone from having a few little problems with nomenclature, 1 letter collections or whatever it may be, to questioning the whole opinio communis, that there is a middle recension of 7 letters that are genuine, because we simply do not have a text with that in on its own. And then whenever I propose this to people who are proponents of the middle recension, most of them do not even know this. They're entirely unaware of this question. And we'll come back to that edition in a minute. We then have the 9 letter collection, which is the one that doesn't have Romans and cuts off halfway through the Tarsians. We have an 11 letters, a 12 letters, a 13 letters, a 15, a 16 letter collection. That should probably say the long recension there, apologies, rather than the middle. And then we have a 17 letter collection, which has both some middle and some long recension manuscripts in it. So you can see that this is a really complex, winding problem. That the idea of 3 letter collections is not just inaccurate, it's wildly misleading and detrimental to the subject. Because if one constrains themselves to this old form of nomenclature, then I think that they end up in a place where they can't even ask the right questions because they don't even see the wood for trees. Now, this would be a problem, a big problem in and of itself, if not for the fact that it's compounded by issues of recensions. Now, again, in this table, I refer quite simply to a short, a middle, and a long recension. But that indeed is also slightly misleading, as we have other recensions too. First and foremost, we do, as I said, have the short recension in Syriac, and we could call that maybe 1 recension. But then in the middle recension, we actually have several different versions. We have Greek, Latin, Syriac, Armenian, Coptic, and Ethiopic. And indeed, there are many significant textual disagreements between just the Greek and Latin, never mind the Syriac, Armenian, Coptic, and Ethiopic. So although they're all banded under this umbrella, the middle recension, sometimes the Greek and Latin disagree with each other in a not inconsiderable, small manner. And that needs to be recognized. Now, I'm not saying that we should go as far as to start labeling them as different recensions per se, but to just assume that these things are always going to affirm each other's readings, again, leaves scholars in a place where they leave out really significant information. And then we get this lively separate transmission of Ignatius to the Romans, not just in the Acts of Martyrdom or on its own, but sometimes in the works of Simeon Metaphrastes, whose version is entirely different to both the short and the so-called middle recension and the long recension. So we've got a fourth recension here, really. Indeed, we might even have already 5 or 6. I mean, I think it's to put an upper bound on it almost seems like a fool's errand. And then, just to compound the question further, we get an Arabic tradition, which is attested in 3 manuscripts listed at the bottom there. So just of Romans, that Arabic tradition, sorry, is just of Romans. Just of Ignatius' letter to the Romans, then, we have at least a so-called short, a so-called middle, a so-called long. We have it in Simeon Metaphrastes and the Acts of Martyrdom on its own and in an Arabic. So maybe 7 recensions of Romans, even before we start to look at the other epistles at play. And this is why, and I think was the great credit to Marcus here, not me, but to recognize that as the first instance, that even before we look at the details or the contents of these epistles in depth, whether it be grammatic or syntactical or lexicographic, etc., this is the initial stage that Ignatius scholarship must get over as a hurdle before they can even engage with the text themselves. And wherever I go and whoever I speak to, there is either a complete ignorance that this great range of manuscripts exists, or B, a willful desire not to engage with them properly, whether it because it's too much effort or they just don't want to believe it, I do not know. But it's certainly a big problem. So what do we have then in conclusion? Let me just help you out here in a summary. If that's all been so much information that you think, gosh, Jack, I'm going to have to rewatch this 10 times to understand it. Very simply, at least 5 recensions, possibly more. We dare not even put an upper bound on it. We have at least 10 different letter collections of various forms in a great amount of languages. And after all of this, the only thing we can be sure that we are missing is a Greek middle recension of 7 letters. That's the only thing we can be sure of. The opinio communis, the acceptance of 7 letters in a middle recension, that's the only thing I can confirm to you without doubt is missing in our manuscript evidence. And I give you a quote just from my forthcoming work on this, because I think this was the best way to sum it up. That the closest we have to the fictional ideal of the 7 letters in the middle recension is either Codex Bodleianus Miscellaneous 15, which contains the 7 letters that are considered authentic, but in their longer form, or one of the witnesses where the middle recension is attested, but only as part of a wider letter collection. They're the only 2 options for either a 7 letters, but again, they're in the long, or for a middle recension, but they're appended with others. Great comment here from Gary S. Feels like I should make my own recension to get a feel for things. Well, indeed, Gary, it seems very much like that was what was going on in the evolution of these texts, that people were adding, chopping, and changing at almost every turn. So with that all out of the way then, in terms of what the letter collections and recensions are, and hopefully you've been able to grasp some of that, I want to just give you a little bit of data, just a sniff of what we're going to be doing in the future on the channel as we look at Ignatius versus Ignatius. What I have here is one of the metrics that I used to understand the milieu from which the different recensions and collections arose. Now, I've only focused in my PhD on the short and the middle recension, GM7 being the Greek middle, SS3, as I mentioned, the short Syriac. And that's because to try and engage with all 17 of these epistles in all of their different recensions would not be a 1-volume work, but a 10-volume work. So we look here just at the data for the 2 recensions. And I thought what I would do is look at their treatment of scripture. I try and understand in what ways the short and the middle recension try and use the canon, particularly the New Testament, as we have it today. Now, to preface the points that I make about this table in my thesis. Number 1, this is absolutely 100% the best case scenario for both the short and the middle recension. By which I mean I have been as generous as I could be to label either a quotation, an echo, or an allusion to canonical texts. So this is the best case scenario that those seeking to find scriptural quotes in the Ignatian epistles can have. This is as good as it gets. And let me tell you, on some occasions, I've not just been generous, I've almost been too fair, and maybe they even need to come out because I've been that kind. But I did that as a methodology because I didn't want anyone to doubt what I was saying, and I still wanted to prove the point without anyone coming back to me. And on most occasions here, these are echoes rather than allusions and quotations, by which I mean these are not direct word-for-word verbatim citations from these canonical texts, nor are they sort of informal references saying, like, as Paul said something like this, blah, 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 blah. It's that they sort of share a similar sense of wording and theme. So again, you can see the stretching of this that I'm making happen, even to get this data out there. So what can you see? Well, on the far right is probably the most telling. That in the 3-letter collection, in total, there are 29 possible allusions to the New Testament, and in the Middle Recension, there are 63. Particularly focused around, in the Middle Recension, 1 Corinthians and Ephesians, and largely ignorant of the Gospels, except maybe in Ephesians. In the Middle Recension, they know quite a bit of Matthew, maybe. And one of the things that struck me immediately about this data, even if it is all true in the best case scenario, is that if one is to accept the Middle Recension as genuine and the 7 letters as the true Ignatiana, then it means that sometime after they were written, perhaps at the end of the 2nd century, as some have suggested, a Christian who valued these works so greatly not only removed 4 of the epistles from the Ignatian corpus, but also chose to remove from them quotes, echoes, or allusions to the New Testament canon. They saw, for example, in Ephesians, 5 perhaps references to Matthew and said, no, I will get rid of them. They saw perhaps 12 references in Ephesians to 1 Corinthians and thought, no, I don't want most of them. And this, to me, seems wild. That someone would go to the effort of maintaining and reproducing these texts whilst removing core Christian messages in a post-Irenaeus era to the canon. And this is not just the case for Scripture, but also for the name of Jesus, for the term Christ, the term Catholic even. There's this constant removal of these normal 2nd century Christian things. And so these are the sort of things, like I say, that you have to look at and that we'll sort of unpick and disentangle over the next few videos to see more evidences of why we think the short recension is earlier than the middle, what that means for the state of New Testament study, and also for the future of Ignatian scholarship moving forward. Marcus, over to you. I mean, you're the great beginner of the Curatonian revival. What do you think?
Just happy to come in and also to answer, or to not to answer, but to engage with what Duncan and Ali were writing. Well, first of all, I think Jack has expounded the question and the problem that we've seen extremely well. The big problem that New Testament scholarship and patristic scholarship had so far was that everything was based on Lightfoot's work. Nobody has gone back to the material, and it was a delusion. If people talk today, and we have every year monographs, PhDs being written on Ignatius, none of these people go back to the material, but just base what they think they are reading on the so-called editions that we have. And we only have editions at the moment of the 7-letter collection, so of the Middle Recension, and simply start from where Lightfoot has left us. And I think Jack has made a great step to walk back and to look at the manuscript evidence. And as you can see, there is a big mess which we need to clean up. not by restricting what we see into a streamline as Lightfoot has done it, but first of all in acknowledging the variety that is on the table. But let's also go back to Duncan and Ali. You're absolutely right. When Jack gives us here comparisons between, let's say, a text under the name of Ignatius and then texts which we recognize as coming from the canonical New Testament, we already assume that these texts of the canonical New Testament are the source and that the Ignatian letters are the recipients. But who knows? I think you're absolutely right. Chicken and egg is first of all to be decided upon. So we cannot assume a clear chronological set of these texts, because as I have tried to advocate for a number of years now, Ignatius is being taken as one of the rock stones and foundations of New Testament scholars for dating New Testament writings. And they were claiming that these 7 letters in the middle recension, as Eusebius was suggesting, were written in the beginning of the 2nd century, so around 107, 110. Hence, if these texts are already quoting or alluding to or echoing the New Testament writings, then these New Testament writings need to be written before 107. Hence, we have this area of New Testament prison or for the texts that are embedded in them, which means in the 1st century. Let me also mention there is a second foundation, and these are the only external foundations, and this is the Didache. Now, we will certainly run a session like this one here, and a few comparisons in the future also on the Didache, because as you can imagine, we have a very similar manuscript and data basis for the Didache, which is similar to the Ignatians. Hence, we end up with the same trajectory, as you will see then when we go through them, as here, chicken and egg. So what's earlier? It could easily be whenever the Didache was written. It could easily be whenever the Ignatian letters were written and by whom, that a text had an impact on the writing also of those texts that we categorize as canonical New Testament texts. Who knows? We don't know. So we have to make that comparison. And Ali, I think you're absolutely right. It is a question which has been on Jack's mind, on my mind for quite some time. And those questions are not immediately decided. We will go through them in the next sessions, and we will look at some of the evidence in detail. And then you can make up your mind, we can make up our minds together, or we can disagree. At least we face the problem and want to ask what makes more sense. And as always in historical studies, there is no clear-cut solution quite easily to get to. Sometimes we are inconclusive. Sometimes we might ponder towards A or B as a solution. Or we come in, or jointly, we will come to a conclusion C or D. And I think this is the pleasure of doing this type of work, where you start from scratch. You look at the material itself, then you start reflecting what could make sense and what is rather less sensible.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that as well, Ali. The need, I think, sometimes to feel like you have to say something inclusive and decisive and eye-catching is a blunder that some scholars make because they're trying to sell books or they're trying to get their word out there and whatever. And I think that one of the great things about the Ignatian question, and I feel pretty confident in saying this at least, is that if someone gives you a decisive answer to the Ignatian question, don't believe them at this moment, right? Because not only do we have the problem that Marcus mentions, that when we're dealing with things in history, it's always difficult, particularly as far back as the history as we have. But for a similar reason as, you know, the Marcionite texts that we study so much here are so brilliant to research is because mostly they've been ignored and the due diligence has not been done on them yet. Hence why such concrete absolutes, either dismissals or acceptances of these texts in a certain manner or a certain way, I think is sometimes unhelpful, because it convinces viewers that, you know, there is a right answer in inverted commas, and actually, you know, never mind the fact that it's difficult to deal with those things all those years ago, we haven't even done the necessary research yet. I mean, someone asked me just the other day, of those canonical references in the short recension that you could even slightly describe as being such, do they attest the apostolos of Marcion or the canon? These things haven't been looked at properly yet. There's so much to be unpacked before we start making further conclusions. And Duncan, on your comment about whether allusions and quotations are chicken and egg, I think that's really, really interesting question, because you could always argue one instead of the other. But one thing I do find, and this is definitely going to be the subject of an entire video, is that where the middle recension sees a possible relationship between the canon and Ignatius, they affirm it. And they try and make it stronger and build it out a bit. And again, if this is happening the other way around, that the middle recension is being redacted into the short, then this is a really weird thought process that the redactor is going through to try and make canonical references be less concrete. And just one example, in Polycarp, Polycarp, chapter 1, verse 3, Ignatius says, "Pray unceasingly." And in the short recension, that's all it says. But in the middle recension, clearly the redactor, to my mind, has seen a reference here to 1 Thessalonians 5:17 and added in the word adialeptos into the text, which Paul uses, I think, to try and make it look like Paul. And this is only a one-word example, but you can see there how someone might want to say, yes, a bit like 1 Thessalonians, let's try and see if we can make that clearer. We'll add in the extra word. Whereas from the other point of view, if someone sees that phrase and says, actually, I want it to be less like 1 Thessalonians 5:17, I will remove it. That to me seems quite difficult to accept. And that's just one of a whole number of occasions we can look at in the future, but certainly one that I think is indicative of the point you're making, Duncan. And maybe we can see there, not a chicken and egg thing. We can see the egg clearly and why it becomes the chicken, i.e. the canonical reference.
And just to give 2 further examples for this kind of, let's say, a New Testamentizing of these texts. In the course of time, people have felt that these Ignatian letters were missing the close connection and the quotation of New Testament texts and also of Old Testament texts, which are almost completely absent. And when we look at these further expansions of the Ignatian corpus, so what Jack has shown, the 13 or 14 letter collection, where 6 new letters came and be added to the 7 letters in the 4th or 5th century, we notice that at the same time they have reworked the 7 letters that potentially already existed, but they were dissatisfied with the fact that even as they felt, these 7 letters contained too few New Testament quotations. So what they did is they sprinkled the New Testament verses across all the letters. Not only are they very present in the 6 letters which they added to the 7, but also in the 7 letters that they received, they added New Testament quotations in almost every, in every chapter, in almost every second or third sentence. That's the kind of gospelization and Paulinization and New Testamentization of early Christian texts. The same you can see when you compare the Didache with manuscripts where most of the Matthew quotes are missing. And then we have manuscripts where you have an extension of Matthew quotations. So the nature seems to be that in the course of time, where the New Testament from the 3rd, 4th century onwards becomes more a common reference basis for Christians, also those Christian texts where these kind of references are missing, one supplants and one adds those New Testament references, and including later also the Old Testament references to such texts. But that puts us back when we look at a three-letter collection here of Ignatius, or a one single letter, where these New Testament and Old Testament echoes, allusions, or quotations are missing. It rather, let's say, one rather gets the impression that this is an earlier stage. Because as Jack rightly said, I mean, who as a Christian would remove New Testament explanations or quotations from a text? Unless he wants to shorten a text. But that's not the case in a way. And if you shorten a text, would you start removing Holy Scripture first? It's not likely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really excited now. This has sort of got me into it, that this series will be good, and it will be a real insight, and it may be a different, to the martial stuff we've been doing. Although in some ways, actually, much of the methodology and process is similar. So it will only feed and enlighten that conversation more as we go. Well, thank you so much for joining us over the last 50 minutes or so. It's been a real pleasure to get some Ignatius back on the channel after the dominance of Marcion, the three patron saints, Curiton, Marcion, and Ignatius of the channel. And I really encourage you to go and look at our previous videos on Curiton, but also the readings that I did of the short recension of Ignatius. You can find them in Corpus Ignatianum by William Curiton, published in 1849. But I thought to read them would be just bringing it to life a little bit. Ignatius through the voice of a 21st century Englishman. Please also do remember to subscribe, not only here to Patristica, but also to Mark Bilby's channel, which I'll link down in the description as soon as the video is over. Until then, please do keep reaching out to us in the comments. We do read them all, even if we don't respond to them. And come and join us in the Discord, where viewers, such as the one who suggested this video, can recommend ideas, thoughts, and questions to us. Until next time, thank you very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.